in all kinds of coalitions, united fronts, with all kinds of people, and made all sorts of alliances with the people who were only temporary allies, or maybe allies that went on for a short time further, but ended up as enemies. And Lenin says, unless you understand the totality of the Bolshevik experience, if you only focus on the revolution, you will never understand why we succeeded in having the revolution. And so he describes the curse of the new international to be a left-wing, ultra-left, childish, infantile, adolescent type understanding of Bolshevism. And he sets out with this essay to try to correct the record. And that's why this is important to us, because you have to look at the process of building a party in the period prior to the revolution with a clear understanding of the universal lessons of Bolshevism, which are not simply, we're going to attack and we're going to decimate the opportunists and we're going to seize the power. It was a lot more complicated than that. It also was a profound statement against sectarianism of any type. And people don't understand this. The bourgeois caricature of Lenin is that Lenin was always ready to split, always ready to divide, always ready to condemn the people who were to the right of him. And that was the school of Lenin. Well, Lenin was obviously very polemical against others who constituted a right-wing form of socialism, but he also made sure not to engage in any sectarianism. And I want to just give an example of what that means. These are things that matter to the PSL. Matter of fact, without these lessons, we cannot hope to succeed as a party. When Lenin came back from Europe after the February Revolution, which was the revolution against Tsarism, he came forward and said, this revolution is inadequate. And all the people, this was in a short pamphlet called the April Thesis, which everyone should also read. He comes and he gives a statement to the party leadership, and he then opens it up to the others in the movement the next day, and he reads his document, and everybody thinks he's gone crazy. Because what Lenin's basically saying is, this revolution, this bourgeois anti-Tsarist revolution, which we've all been hoping for, waiting for, agitating for, it's not able to solve the social problem of the moment, just for Russia to end its participation in World War I. The working class, the peasantry, the soldiers had gone into a state of rebellion because the war was crushing them. The peasants couldn't eat, they couldn't go home to farm, they were at the front lines. 3 million people had died, and the new revolutionary government, in spite of all of its revolutionary pronouncements, would not end the participation of Russia in World War I for a variety of reasons, which I don't want to talk about in a moment. So Lenin says, we have to have a second revolution. We're going to overthrow this revolution and create another revolution. And everybody's thinking like, that's crazy. We just made this revolution. It's a month old. Everyone was euphoric and optimistic. Finally, the centuries of Tsarism had come to an end, and now we're going to overthrow the new government. And Lenin said at first, no, we can't call for a new revolution to overthrow this revolution because the majority of people are still optimistic. But its own contradictions will be demonstrated in the weeks and months to come, and principally its inability to exit from World War I. And as a consequence, it will weaken and its support will wane, and new opportunities will open up for the left. 6 weeks later, after the April Thesis, that is all coming true. The war is continuing, the war is advancing, more casualties, the Russian army is still losing. And now, as a consequence of the emergence of what are called Soviets, which are councils of workers and councils of peasants and councils of soldiers. There were workers Soviets, peasant Soviets, and soldier Soviets. The Soviet is the Russian word for council. kind of like what the Occupy movement was. Spontaneous, grassroots organizations that the different parties tried to influence. The Mensheviks tried to influence it, the Social Democrats meaning. The Social Revolutionaries, also to the right of the Bolsheviks tried to influence it. By June and July, when it was clear that the revolutionary provisional government would not leave World War I, they could not exit from the war, Lenin said, we must adopt a new slogan because now the time for revolution has come. And what was the slogan of the Bolsheviks at that time? All power to the Soviets. Now think about that. That sounds very radical. That means the Soviets, the workers and soldiers and peasant councils are going to take the power. But who was the leadership of the Soviets in June of 1917? It was the Mensheviks. It was the Social Revolutionaries. It was the Reformists, the same people Lenin had been polemicizing for four years. So here's Lenin saying the next stage will be the demand all power to the Soviets, when the Bolsheviks were a tiny minority in the Soviets. They were small in comparison. That demonstrates the absence of sectarianism, that Lenin's position could be, we want the parties who we've been denouncing for the last 4 years to be the leadership of the institution that will take power. And some of the comrades said, what, you want the Mensheviks to take power? It would be like us calling for the DSA to take power. Like, that's what we're fighting for? And he said, yes, we call for them. They're the majority right now. They have the majority sentiment. And the Soviets can take power. The workers want to take the power. And they don't yet know about the Bolsheviks. They don't have enough experience with us. And furthermore, the Mensheviks won't take power. The Social Revolutionaries won't take power. So by demanding that the Mensheviks and the Reformists take the power that was there, it exposed the fact that the Reformists would not break with the bourgeoisie. Because the bourgeoisie was only in power because the Soviets weren't taking the power. And the Soviets wouldn't take power because of the Reformists. So if Lenin had said the Menshevik leadership of the majority leadership of the Soviets is a sellout organization, it'll never lead to the revolution, people who were the majority of supporters of the Soviets who were then following Reformists would have said, well, they're just, sectarians. They're not left enough. But this is our party. We are Mensheviks. We are social revolutionaries. But by virtue of demonstrating that he wanted the Soviets under the Reformist leadership to take power and the refusal of the Reformists to do just that, it showed the rank and file of the Reformists that the Bolsheviks were not sectarian, but they were serious about revolution. And over the next 2 or 3 months, the Bolsheviks become the majority in the Soviets, principally because as the crisis continues to unfold, the contradictions continue to mount, the Reformists refuse to do that which is necessary, which is to seize the power in the name of the working class and the peasantry and say, we are done with the bourgeoisie and we are leaving the imperialist alliance with France and Britain and the United States, the other principal parties who Russia was an ally with in World War I. That's how it happened. It was a profoundly anti-sectarian position. I want everyone to remember that as we read this book. There was another thing that he's addressing in the book, which we'll come to, the question of compromise. The people who were grouped around the Third International, again, they saw the Leninists as uncompromising because they made the revolution. And Lenin said, no, we made all kinds of compromises. And in fact, if we had not made compromises, we couldn't have made the revolution. Now, I want people to think about what it means to compromise, and compromise with reformists, or compromise even with bourgeois elements. For us as the PSL, because this is about our tactics. What is a labor contract? What is a union contract, a collective bargaining agreement between the working class and the employers? It's a treaty, it's a truce, it's an agreement that regulates the terms of exploitation between the working class and the employer. It's not about revolution. A collective bargaining agreement, which is what all unions are fighting for, which regulates wages and benefits. They're trying to get more for the workers, more in pay, more in benefits. Those are compromises between the bosses and the working class. Should workers be in the unions and doing collective bargaining? The people around the Third International said, no, we don't want a treaty with the bosses. We want to overthrow the bosses. But Lenin's whole argument was the unions become the school for revolution, where the working class, not just the vanguard, but the broad masses of people, have to go through their own experiences. And the communists have to go through those experiences with them. You can't jump ahead and tell people unions are bad because they're just regulating exploitation. We want to end exploitation. The workers have to go through that process. What about working with reactionaries? Well, you know, again, here I want to read a quote to you from left-wing communism, if I can find it, which I hope I can. Just give me a second, comments. Okay, here it is. Prior to the downfall of Tsarism, again, these are not directly applicable to us, but the spirit of the tactics is what we have to keep in mind. Prior to the downfall of Tsarism, the Russian Revolutionary Social Democrats, that would be the Leninists, made repeated use of the services of the bourgeois liberals. They concluded numerous practical compromises with the latter. In 1901 and 1902, they even united with this guy Struve, who was one of the leaders of bourgeois liberalism. They say, Lenin goes on and says, that doesn't mean we stop polemicizing against them and stop exposing their politics, but we formed alliances with them. The Bolsheviks have always adhered to this policy. Since 1905, they have systematically advocated an alliance between the working class and the peasantry against the liberal bourgeoisie and Tsarism, never, however, refusing to support the bourgeoisie against Tsarism, for instance, during the second rounds of elections or during second ballots, and never ceasing the relentless ideological and political struggle against the socialist revolutionaries, and again, to the right, the bourgeois revolutionary peasant party, exposing them as petty bourgeois Democrats, blah, blah, blah. In other words, even in the Duma elections, they would run their own candidates. And if they didn't make it to the second round, the Bolshevik policy was to support the bourgeois Democrats against the Tsarist political forces. Why? Because the Bolshevik program had at its center the overthrow of Tsarism and the creation of a democratic republic, which they considered to be an absolute necessary stage for the then socialist revolution, that it had to go through the stage of forming a democratic, that is, bourgeois republic. So they waged a war against the bourgeoisie and against their political parties ideologically, but if confronted with a choice between supporting Tsarist representatives and bourgeois Democrats, Lenin's policy, and they adhered to it from 1905, was to always support the bourgeoisie, the bourgeois Democrats, the bourgeois nationalists, so to speak, against the Tsarists. Now, that's a shock to all these left-wing communists who are now grouped in the Third International, because they don't actually know the history. They don't understand the profound tactical nuance. Lenin's orientation towards compromise was not that compromise was impossible. He insisted compromise is absolutely necessary. The question is, what kind of compromise? Is it a sellout? Is it treachery? Or is it the most that the working class can get, either for material gain or ideological gain? Take again the union struggle. You can be arguing, and for comrades who have had actual experience with workers in organizing union strikes and struggles, you can say we're demanding a 5% increase. We need it. We haven't had an increase in 10 years. You go out and strike. Everybody's strong at first. The question is how to keep them strong, how to stop people from scamming, how to stop people from getting scared. They've been without pay 2 days, 3 days, now a week. They're getting desperate. I have a mortgage to pay. I have rent to pay. I can't keep striking. The bosses come back and say, well, we're not going to give you 5%, we're going to give you 2%. then you have to look around. You have to say, how strong are we? Or what can we do to keep the workers strong, to keep fighting in spite of their fear? How do we keep going in spite of their desperation? How do we bolster their morale? How do you do these things? And only based on the relationship of forces partly determined by our own tactics can we make the determination of what level of compromise. Because ultimately, collective bargaining is a compromise about the terms of exploitation. So the point is, do you sell out because it's hard, or do you fight and fight and fight, but then realize at a certain point, if we keep fighting, we will weaken, in which case you take the compromise available to you. That's the question. It's not about compromise or no compromise. It's not about making alliances or not making alliances. And you'll see as you read this book, Lenin goes through the role of the party is to train the cadres to understand the distinction between a necessary compromise, a necessary alliance, a necessary maneuver with what might be considered to be a sellout. And again, advocating for alliances with non-party forces, united fronts with non-party forces who have something progressive to play for at least the time being. How much time have I spoken?
26.
So I'm a minute over.
Yes.
So in the last minute of my presentation, and again, this is just kind of a primer, so we'll all study together for the next weeks and months. After the revolution, the Bolsheviks had to make even more compromises. They couldn't defeat the counter-revolution. 14 imperialist armies invaded, including the United States. 3 million Russians died, and other people from the Russian Empire who were fighting for the Bolshevik cause. Most of the communists died at the front lines, because who else is going to rush to the front lines when the reactionaries and the landlords and the imperialists are invading? So how did they survive? How did they win? The Bolsheviks recruited what they considered to be the nationalist elements of the Tsarist establishment, of the Tsarist military, and recruited them into the Red Army. Because the workers didn't have military training. They didn't have enough leadership. They needed the educated classes of the old society to help go into battle. So they were able to recruit some sector of the old Tsarist military apparatus who, on the basis of opposing foreign intervention in their country, could be recruited. And then the Bolsheviks created what's called the commissar system. They said to the Tsarist generals, lead us into battle because we don't know how to lead the way you do in a complicated military situation. But lead us well, and if there's any treachery on your part, we will shoot you. And that's the job of our political commissar, the comrade from the steering committee who was assigned to be with you. So they made a compromise. And that's how they did it. That's how the commissar system, because they had to rely on unreliable elements from the old Tsarist military to go into this protracted 3-year-long war. Mao Zedong and the Red Army in China, they recruited whole divisions of Chiang Kai-shek's military and some warlord armies too, and then recruited them and educated them and brought them over. Kim Il-sung did the same thing in North Korea. Just as the war was breaking out in 1950, a whole division of puppet troops on the south side were recruited by the Workers' Party of Korea and incorporated into the Korean People's Army. There's so many compromises. Like the rich lessons of revolution have to be explored, and our cadres have to be trained in all of the practical experiences of how to maneuver, how to compromise, how to have a united front, and then how to break the united front, how to break the coalition, how to understand that none of these things are permanent, that they're instruments on the road to revolution. And that at the time of revolution, which only comes when the oppressed masses can no longer live in the old way, and when the petty bourgeoisie is also in crisis, and when the ruling class becomes paralyzed because of its own interfactional struggle, only under those circumstances will a revolutionary moment arise. The question is, do we have a party available at the time of those opportunities to take advantage of that kind of rarely created situation? And Lenin's basic argument in this essay, of this masterpiece, is that you can't become ready for revolution without understanding all of Bolshevism and also experiencing all the twists and turns and zigs and zags and complicated maneuvers and compromises and united fronts that they went through, that we too will go through. In other words, with that spirit and with a spirit of absolute opposition to sectarianism, while at the same time maintaining a rock-hard adherence to our fundamental principles.
All right, thank you, Comrade. So now we're going to move on to our next talk, which is Comrade Nino Brown. Nino?
How going, comrades? So I'm gonna kind of pick up where Brian left off. That we want to do things in the spirit of Leninism, and not necessarily in the exact letter, because the situations that took place in Russia are not a direct one-to-one application to the situation that we face here. So my talk is really structured around why is it essential for us as a growing organization to study left-wing communism and to assimilate these lessons as we grow, right? So I'm going to start with two quotes. They're both 20 years apart to show the growth of Lenin, right? Because you can't really understand Lenin just by seeing what he said in 1905 or seeing what he said in 1917 or 1921. You really have to understand the totality of Lenin and his growth and development in thought. So the first quote is, "We, on the other hand, consider that the only events in which the actors are the masses themselves, which are born out of their sentiments, are not staged with the special aim by one or the other organization, are able to have a really serious, agitational, and not only arousing, but an educational effect. We think that a whole 100 assassinations of the czars will never have such an arousing and educational effect as will the mere participation by tens of thousands of working people in meetings discussing their vital interests and the connection between politics and those interests, as participation in a struggle that really raises ever more new, untouched strata of the proletariat to a more conscious life, to a wider revolutionary struggle," right? So obviously people today are not assassinating czars, right? But think about what are the isolated actions that some folks who may deem themselves to be leftists take, right? That are really isolated from the masses and don't bring a mass perspective that can really educate people. So that was Lenin in 1902. So this is Lenin in 1922, right? Building off what Brian said. The idea of building communist society exclusively with the hands of communists is childish, absolutely childish. The communists are drops in the ocean of the people, right? So we see this consistency, but also this growth, right? This consistent mass approach, right? And as we'll see throughout this discussion, as you read the text, that there's this trend, this line of thought against, individualism. And I'll get more into what are the new forms of individualism that we face today, right? With social media, primarily, right? So thank you all for taking the time to be here for this important study. The question of left-wing communism may seem obscure and even abstract to those who may already consider themselves to be on the political left. And what I'm going to do is outline why our party needs to firmly grasp what left communism is and its relation to the task of party building, mass work, and overall consolidation on various fronts. So it's said that to be a revolutionary, your job is to make a revolution. I'm going to augment it a little more and say, in the spirit of our party, that the job of a revolutionary is to make more revolutionaries. Our party was formed with the understanding of the objective conditions for a revival of socialism. But only socialists can build socialism. It's not going to arise spontaneously, and socialism can only come about with a revolutionary overthrow of the social order, right? No easy task at all. So right now, our comrades all across this nation are learning and struggling how to build mass organizations, how to strengthen and steel the party's ideological line, how to consolidate our gains, right? How to build a revolutionary movement that is fundamentally anti-imperialist and anti-racist. Capitalism is entering into a new pre-crisis, and the objective movement of capital and its internal processes are beyond the scope of our control, right? But what do we control? We control the subjective factor, right? The subjective forces of the revolution. We control how organized we are, how disciplined we are, how ideologically skilled we are, how connected we are to the masses of working and oppressed people, right? So this next point I'm going to focus on is that there are many paths. The path to revolution has many obstacles, right? As Brian elaborated, many compromises, temporary retreats, attacks, defenses, right? But on this path to revolution, we cannot be an obstacle to ourselves, right? We have to assimilate these past lessons so we're not in our own way. So as we've seen with the Egyptian revolution, the Occupy Wall Street movement, and the Black Lives Matter movement, that if we, the revolutionary forces of society, who have a vision and a program for the transformation of society, are weak and are unable to strongly influence, if not lead the masses of people, then we will simply have a reconstitution of the same bourgeois social order with minor changes at best, right? There's a saying that I kind of grew up with, politics abhors the void, right? Wherever there's a void, some political force is going to fill it. In the Egyptian revolution, it was the Muslim Brotherhood, not because they were the most radical, but because they were the most organized, and they had some social welfare services to folks, right? Whereas the common mantra was, we're a leaderless revolution. Well, somebody's going to lead it, right? So we can't be that naive. So for the party to grow into a force that can lend sustained leadership to the struggles of the masses of working and oppressed people, it is important that we assimilate the lessons from revolutionary movements that have not only challenged capitalism, but have actually built an alternative, socialism. So this means that we have to study, obviously, Lenin and the Bolsheviks, but that we also have to study the Cuban Revolution, the Chinese Revolution, the Vietnamese Revolution, the Korean Revolution, right? But we're only going to restrict ourselves here to talking about the Bolshevik Revolution. And obviously, folks notice that we're not academics. We're not trying to wage a war of just words with obscure, glaring, with the necessity of social transformation confronting us every single day. It's the necessity for socialism is what drives the party, right? We're not here to elect Democrats. We're not here to, toot our own horns, right? The entire society is screaming out for socialism. And we also know that, making a revolution is no dinner party. And as Lenin said, you can't make a revolution in white gloves. You have to get dirty. And in his text, Left Wing Communism, Lenin says himself, right? Russia achieved Marxism, the only correct revolutionary theory, virtually through suffering, by a half a century of unprecedented torment and sacrifice, of unprecedented revolutionary heroism, incredible energy, devoted searching, study, testing and practice, disappointment, verification, and comparison with European experience, right? We compare our experience with the entire world, right? Because the revolution did not take place in Europe. It took place mainly in what is called the third world or the global south. So we can't state ahead of time that we've overcome every single obstacle that our class will face. We cannot even predict what obstacles are going to confront us, right? But what we can do is prepare ourselves by imbibing the lessons of not just Russia, but all of the lessons of the global class struggle from Egypt to France, from Venezuela to Nepal, from Greece to Turkey. And we have to learn from the suffering, the sacrifices, the victories of our comrades in struggle all over the world. Because if we refuse to learn, if we refuse to assimilate and humble ourselves, we will certainly become obstacles to ourselves in building a revolutionary movement, right? So who's read some Mao Zedong, right? So Mao says, we can either march with the masses, we can march ahead of them, or we can tail behind them, right? And he says about these two orientations, about those who have a rightist orientation and those who have a leftist orientation. He says, those with a rightist way of thinking make no distinction between ourselves and the enemy, and take the enemy for our own people. They regard as friends the very persons whom the broad masses regard as enemies. Those with a left way of thinking magnify contradictions between ourselves and the enemy, to such an extent that they take certain contradictions among the people for contradictions with the enemy and regard as counter-revolutionaries persons who are not actually counter-revolutionaries. I myself can say I've been there. right? Where you think you're so radical that everyone else is not on our level, right? They're not on our caliber. We have to just denounce everyone else and expose everyone else, and that's how we're going to win over the masses to a revolutionary party, right? But unfortunately, that's not how it works, right? So today we see various tendencies cropping up within the broad left and progressive movement. We have new forms of rightism and leftism, and while we must reflect on the past communist movements, this cannot substitute for a concrete analysis of the concrete conditions that we face today, right? So we see that, at the same time, those who have a leftist, ultra-leftist orientation, they make enemies of friends and obscure contradictions among ourselves, among the people, by magnifying these differences, so to the point that, we're almost at each other's throats, right? And these leftists, they sometimes quite literally march so far ahead of the people and magnify the secondary, minor contradictions, right? That to the point that we do believe that revolution is not made by the masses of people, but they're just made by folks who are just the reddest of red communists and socialists. You just have to wave the red flag hard enough. Have as many revolutionary phrases, call for revolution right now, right? We see this with some parties that say, in the name of humanity, we need to have revolution right now, this moment, right? But we cannot just throw out phrases and expect the revolution to fall from the sky. So we see this as a grave error. And fortunately for our party, we have the wisdom of decades of experience in the struggle to be educated by our new comrades and other comrades to navigate correctly. We are reminded of Lenin's words that, one of the most dangerous mistakes made by communists is the idea that revolution, that the idea of a revolution can be made by revolutionaries alone, right? And as Black revolutionary Assata Shakurov, which everyone in this room should know, said that without the support of the people, no movement for liberation can exist, no matter how correct its analysis of the situation is. That's why political work and organizing are so important. Unless you are addressing the issues people are concerned about and contributing a positive direction, they'll never support you. The first thing the enemy tries to do is isolate revolutionaries from the masses of people, making us horrible and hideous monsters so that the people will hate us, right? So thinking again, we cannot do this to ourselves, right? We cannot do the work of the bourgeoisie for ourselves. We cannot be an obstacle to our own party, right? So we can't afford to isolate ourselves, right? No matter how correct our analyses are. Because if we fail to translate them into concrete policies, right? Policies that can not only meet people where they're at, which is often used as an excuse to leave people where they're at, right? And raise consciousness of the masses, then we're not going to succeed in building a revolutionary movement, right? So at the same time, we see all across this country, even to an extent in the United Kingdom, that socialism is in the air again, and many are looking for answers that socialists should be able to provide. Many people think that socialism is a utopia, or at least this is how the corporate media portrays it when they're not maligning it, conjuring up the ghosts of Mao or Stalin, right? So what does it mean for us that socialism is increasing in popularity? Does it mean that we simply declare loudly that we are socialists, we're the reddest of red socialists? Yes, but that's not all. It's not even primary for us, right? What's even more important is that we demonstrate what is distinctive of our party. Our party is a vanguard party, and vanguard simply means to lead. And the party cannot just declare itself as the vanguard. That must be left to the masses in history, right? As the Black Panther Party put it, the vanguard is merely the tip of the spear, right? And the rest of the spear, the mantle or the butt, right? That's what does the real damage. And our movement's ability to land blows against imperialism, against the ruling class, depend simultaneously on the sharpness of the vanguard and the determination of the masses. If the masses are determined and our links with them are deep and broad and genuine, then the spear will not only pierce our enemies, but land a fatal blow. And folks familiar with Huey P. Newman, founder of the Black Panther Party, right? He says this about manifestations of ultra-leftism after, former Panther Eldridge Cleaver defected from the party. He said, in the quest for their freedom and their attempts to prevent the oppressor from stripping them of all the things that they need to exist, the people see things moving from A to B to C, right? They do not see things moving from A to Z, right? In other words, they have to see some first basic accomplishments in order to realize that major successes are possible, right? Much of the time, the revolutionary will have to guide them in this understanding, but they can never take them from A to Z in one jump because it's too far ahead. Therefore, when the revolutionary begins to indulge in Z or final conclusions, the people can't relate to them, right? So I teach, right? I can't just go to my coworkers and say, hey, communism is going to fix all the problems of our education system, right? We need to actually walk our coworkers through, walk our family and friends through the particulars, right? Of the how does this particular struggle against this budget cut relate to the general totality of capitalist oppression, right? Because if we just ramp on Z, right, we need communism now, communism now, communism now, communism now, without actually guiding people through these concrete struggles, right? We're just going to isolate people and make a caricature of ourselves, right? So for us as Marxists, we know that theory and practice are inseparable. Our analyses are not just empty phrases, nor are they just analysis for analysis' sake. Dr. King often said that we can't get caught in the paralysis of analysis, and we see this with social media and Facebook. You know, people just so caught up in analyzing, that they forget that analysis is supposed to serve something. It's supposed to serve practice, serve action, right? And we know that Marxism is not a dogma, but it's a guide to action, right? And Lenin says, you know, when Lenin got, again, really key, says, we stand wholly on the basis of the theory of Marx. This theory was the first to transform socialism from utopia into a science, to lay down a firm foundation for this science and to indicate the path that must be followed in the further developing this science and elaborating it in all of its parts, right? So this is in 1899, right? Saying that Marxism is not a dogma, right? It's a guide to action. And we see that throughout the course, right, of Lenin's development and Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, and then the Bolshevik Party, right? That you cannot just apply things one-to-one, but actually make concrete analyses and add on to the science, right? So, like I said, Dr. King mentioned this paralysis of the analysis, where activists will be so caught in analyzing a phenomenon that they forget that the essence, right, of analysis is to change the world, right? So in the work we do, we have to have a mass-based approach if we believe that the masses of people make revolution, not just parties, right? So we can't proceed from what we just subjectively desire, but from concrete analyses. And you know, many leftists make this error that we call subjectivism, of substituting their personal desires for what they think is necessary for a particular set of conditions, right? Or sometimes they disregard the conditions entirely, right? Because in their hearts, they really want revolution, and they believe that they can just will themselves to it. But we all know that that's not how things work, right? When making revolution. So we face complex and mounting tasks to defeat capitalist imperialism and the so-called belly of the beast. And no amount of revolutionary phrase-mongering and flag-waving can accomplish this task for us, right? Amilcar Cabral said that we're not going to defeat imperialism by waging insults at it, right? So our party runs comrades for certain positions, most notably during the presidential election session. And we run a campaign unlike any other bourgeois political campaign. Our comrades are activists and organizers. They're in the streets with the people. They are struggling in mass organizations to win the demands of the masses, whether they be around housing and gentrification, prison reforms, wages, union struggles, the fight against police terror, and our campaign, the PSL campaign, during this very polarizing time, right, the elections, we seek to be a pole for all those disaffected by the system to draw them to socialist politics. And we have a political program which put forth demands as, for example, reparations for African Americans, Hawaiians, and other oppressed nations, the dismantling of the imperialist state, shutting down all of the bases, and the combating of women's and LGBTQ oppression, right? We never hear anything about that from the Democrats or the Republicans, right? And we've been criticized by certain internet leftists, put it that way, who put forward the idea that even just participating in bourgeois elections is pointless, and that we should simply just boycott them and call for a revolution now, right? They deem the elections to be a farce of democracy, and you know, we tend to agree, but our point of demarcation is that in the spirit of Leninist tactics and left-wing communism, and Lenin criticized those lefts who refuse to work in reactionary trade unions, and today when most unions that remain are mainly not necessarily class struggle unions seeking to abolish wage slavery, right? Should we refuse to work in them? right? We can. I myself am a part of a union. You know, we have problems and contradictions with teachers, but we have to work through those contradictions to raise the level of teachers' consciousness, to fight for things beyond just budget cuts, right? To fight for the communities that we serve. So surely we would be simply charlatans, right? If we just refuse to do the necessary work, if we'd be in fact throwing the workers into the arms of the social chauvinists, the opportunists, the right-wing forces that exist in all these formations, whether they be unions or mass organizations. If we just take a hands-off approach, saying we're simply too radical, right? When you guys become as radical as us, then you can join our club, right? We'd be going nowhere, right? So, in that same vein, Engels says, universal suffrage is, within the framework of a bourgeois state, but cannot and never will be more than a gauge for the maturity of the working class, right? I would say we haven't even yet to really use and employ the tactic on a mass scale, right? So we haven't really mastered this tactic yet. People are denouncing it, right? You cannot put down any weapon that we have because we have no, we don't have the opportunity, right, to just denounce certain forms of struggle. So our campaign won nearly 75,000 votes, which is more than any socialist ticket since 1976, and the second most votes any California peace and freedom presidential candidate has ever received. And speaking about the campaign, Gloria, she said, "We met thousands of people who responded positively to our platform, and it's inspiring to see the growing popularity of socialism and its principles, which include the right to housing, education, healthcare, full rights for immigrants and all people, the rejection of war, racism, misogyny, mass incarceration, police brutality," right? And our comrades were able to meet people all across the country, and help to push the message of socialism even further, right? We're able to organize the unorganized, right? Tap those folks who were just isolated, right? And thought that they were the only socialists in their town, right? So while the corporate funded media were shutting down their offices the day after the election, Gloria and the campaign organizers were leading marches and protests against the elevation of racism, misogyny, and the xenophobic President Donald Trump, right? And since the elections, we haven't stopped organizing, right? And in fact, through the campaign, we met more and more people. Many of who here has joined the party through the electoral campaign? Okay, so we wouldn't have met you without that campaign. So several polls have indicated that among the youth, they say that the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, they're doing a very poor job in representing the American people, and that a third party is needed. And in fact, the 2016 elections demonstrated for all to see that there was a growing number of people in this country who see themselves as political independents. And according to the Observer, 46.9% of eligible voters did not vote in the 2016 elections at all, right? Not counting the millions of undocumented immigrants and those who are disenfranchised by the criminal justice system. So what are we to do during these times, right? Sit on our hands and stay on the sidelines and just raise the reddest of red slogans and phrases to the masses, call for revolution without the people, right? So this is a text. Who's read Storming the Gates? It's our PSL publication. Okay, so as you read Storming the Gates, as you read Left Wing Communism, I would read that alongside Storming the Gates to give some vital context, because it's not simply just enough to be in the PSL, right? For us to truly develop a living and breathing body that can carry the struggle in a highly concentrated way after all the protests and the street actions take place, right? What we need is called cadre. Comrades who know that we have guidelines, right? A constitution, a program, and that these exist for comrades to help to become more disciplined. It's much more harder to be disciplined now with this neoliberal, counter-revolution, and to a large extent, social media has sown the seeds of new forms of bourgeois individualism, where now you can be the reporter, you can be the news, you can be everything that used to take a lot of collective hands to put together a party line, right? But now you can do that through the button on your phone. So, at times, instead of trying to professionally and clearly explain things to the people, we do what sometimes referred to as dunking, right? Dunking on people on Facebook. And this often assumes what is essentially an ultra-left position that one sees himself as being beyond explaining things to the people, right? And they forget that, it's not what you say, but who is watching what you say, your coworkers, your family, your friends, right? People who are potentially comrades and communists, right? And if we're to assume this position, in real life, or as, you have to say IRL, in real life, right? Surely we would isolate ourselves from the masses, right? And the party would become irrelevant if we acted the way some people act online, right? We'd be seen as standoffish and snobby, and not the patient, disciplined, and pedagogic comrades that we need and the comrades that we are, right? And coming from bourgeois society with all of its ills, we're inculcated with bourgeois individualism day in and day out, right? We see our individuals be genuine freedom, taking discipline from an organization that isn't our job or our boss. Because when it comes to our jobs, we can take discipline then, and being expected to do more for the party, our mass organizations, and ultimately becoming a revolution, right? And sometimes it hurts, hurts our egos, right? And we necessarily have to put our egos aside for something that's greater than our egos. And I was there as well, but grew out of it with the help of comrades like yourself in this room. And our comrades are what I believe to be shining examples of self-sacrifice, dedication, communist ethics, thinking about what's the best for the working class at this moment, right? Not what's good for me, not what's good for this certain political tendency, but what's good for the working class, right? That's the basis of communist ethics. And their commitment to advancing the struggle must be that of, the professional revolutionary who carries on when others falter, right? And flees to safety and comfort. And our credo has to be for the self, nothing, for the masses, everything. Because unlike the ultra lefts, right, who forget that they are part of an organization, or not just a loose organization of like-minded individuals, right? We seek to build cadres who know that a revolutionary vanguard is only as strong and as solid as the members or the cadre who carry the organization, right? So we know that it's vital for our comrades to be good at communicating as a teacher, educators, right? Folks who work in the service industry, we do this every day, right? We know that it's vital to be good at communicating and connecting with other oppressed people, right? They must be natural. Some of us are natural leaders, some of us are trained, right? And if we use and abuse things like social media and project ourselves simply as individuals, right? And we fail to see that this will harm not only ourselves, but our organization, what good is having a program, guidelines, constitution, candidacy, if we're simply just going to continue to act as if we're just a social group of like-minded individuals, right? So our cadre have to be patient, sensitive, tolerant, and most important, good at listening. Cadres must raise their level of discipline. And I know this is not easy, but if it were easy, I wouldn't even be here right now. I'd probably be still in Boston. I'd be dealing with matters that just pertain to my branch, and as a teacher, I see the need for communication, patience, discipline, listening skills, collectivity, execution, going over mistakes, having a mind for the entire class, and more, and a need for moving the entire body forward, right? Because usually in my classroom, it's like 20 plus kids, 9 to 10-year-olds, and I can't just teach one part of the class. This past year I had a student who was functionally illiterate, could not read C-spot run, could not do single-digit addition and subtraction in the 5th grade, right? And I have students who are reading in 6th grade level, so I can't just teach one section of my class. The entire class has to move forward as a whole, right? And I have to accept that discipline on my job, right? So we're gonna wrap up, right? Talking mainly about revolutionary optimism, but also the need for people's rage, right? Because it's hard to be optimistic amidst all of the cynicism that we see in social media and individualism. Neoliberalism doesn't really lend us a hand in that. So we all know that a revolutionary is the most earth-shattering affair, and that it dissolves all the past social relations of the base and reconstitutes society anew. And before that can happen, all of the political currents have to be exposed. The Democrats, the Republicans, right? The opportunists and hanger-ons, right? And in this period of rapidly decaying capitalist society, all these issues are coming to the fore: housing, education, healthcare, right? But this is a quote from Storming the Gates, right? From our comrade Jody Dean, right? Not every single potential president Not every potential present in the masses forwards the revolution. Figuring out the correct path and keeping together the alliance through which we can all win becomes increasingly difficult, right? The role of a revolutionary party is not to make revolution. That's up to the masses of people. Our job is to raise consciousness, right? Show the correct forms of struggle, right? And that means that the party has to learn from the struggle of the masses and adjust its interpretations and practices as necessary. Our responses to the present in light of the projected future are inscribed into the party's structures and our theory, right? So oftentimes we think that, you think of the party as an abstract thing, right? But the party is made up of living people here, right? So when we say build, we have a slogan in Boston, build the party. You are the party, right? If you can't get in touch with the national for something, we make your own business card, right? We made little brochures, right? Took a science trifold board and used that to make advertisements and agitation, right? We need to be innovators and not see the party as something just necessarily above us, but something that we are a part of essentially. So Lenin was a visionary, right? And I'm gonna end here saying that, to quote Mao Zedong, and next is gonna be the 70th anniversary of the World Historic Chinese Revolution, that communists must never separate themselves from the majority of the people or neglect them by leading only a few progressive contingents in an isolated and rash advance, but must take care and forge close links between the progressive elements and the broad masses. This is what thinking in terms of the majority means, right? So as we move forward, we have to always have a mass perspective. We always have to remind ourselves that we are the party. As we build it, we are the party, right? It's not something outside of us, above us, right? We are essentially the vehicle, right? So with that, I want to end and just say to everyone, forward together, not one step back, right? We have to continue to study together, build together, right? And although we may not know all of the names and terms in Lenin's pamphlet, right? We have the wisdom and the experiences of comrades like Gloria, Preston, Brian, Esteban, right? And so on and so forth to help us assimilate these lessons so we do not become obstacles to ourselves in building a revolutionary movement. So with that, thank you.
Okay, so Comrade Jane, you're the host now, so you can share your video and your audio.
Okay, so how do we make us the foreground? Share.
Can people see us as the main thing?
No, I don't think so. Yep. Okay, looks good. So go for it, Jane.
Okay, comrades, can everybody hear me? All right, yes, okay. Comrades, after these great talks by Brian and Nino, I hope you're all very excited to start studying this classic work by Lenin. It's not very long, but there's a lot of meaning and a lot of historical context that Brian addressed, a little bit anyways, and we really want to provide our members with support for reading this book, as well as the opportunity to talk about it and to apply the ideas as part of our pre-Congress discussions and preparations. And to that end, in the national staff, we have prepared materials to support the reading process and the discussing process. I want to acknowledge the collective work of the comrades who've worked on these study materials, from making sure we actually have books to read, to developing the reading discussion guides, to organizing this webinar that we're on right now. For me, I just wanted to say that reading Left-Wing Communism when I was a 19-year-old was a life-changing experience. I joined the party when I was a high school student, and I had, at the time that I read it, I was a college student, and when did I get muted?
A student.
Okay, I read it as a 19-year-old student. I was a student, and anyways, we'd just been involved in a struggle against fee increases, tuition increases, which had kind of arisen spontaneously, and we were able to play a leading role in this struggle. And at the end of that process, where a lot of different pieces sort of came together, a lot of different forces arose in the struggle. A lot of the things I saw and had experienced in that struggle came to make sense to me when I read this book by Lenin. And I came to value the leadership of my experienced comrades even more than I already did. Getting to study this work collectively with all my comrades is something I personally am really looking forward to. First of all, let's talk about the book itself. The publications department has prepared a paper version of the book based on the Marxist Internet Archive edition. And this can be ordered on the PSL store. However, you can't just go to the PSL store and order it. You have to have an account. So for branches where you have a person who's already in charge of ordering literature, that person should be able to bulk order copies of the book for members of the branch. And these cost $6 each. They're like, oh, someone's gonna bring me a copy right now to show you all. And they're like sort of like a course pack. It's a bound copy of the book. And so some people, maybe you're a little averse to writing in a book that you've purchased, but this is more of a course pack, and so you should feel comfortable. It's prepared specifically for the purposes of studying. Here it is, and looks backwards, sorry. And so you should feel free to write in it, highlight it, put sticky notes all over it, and this may help you study more effectively. We've also sent to steering committees links for other ways to access the book, but we really hope that people will order these books that have already been prepared by our publications department. So to summarize, the first step is to make sure that everybody has a copy of the book to study from. Next, this morning, you should have received a reading guide via email. And just to be clear, please use the most recent reading guide that was received. An earlier guide was sent out in error, an earlier draft of the guide. Please use the one that has 2 attachments. One version is a PDF. And so if you like to write by hand as you're reading, you could use the PDF version. It has little spaces with lines in it after each question, so you could actually write with a pen or a pencil your answers. Alternately, some people prefer to type their answers. So we have a Word version, a PDF, not a PDF, excuse me, a Word doc version that you could download and have on your computer so that you could type your answers into that Word doc and, of course, save it. The questions are exactly the same, but we understand that different people have different preferences in their studying and learning process. So if you love to write by hand, use the PDF. If you prefer to type, use the Word doc. The questions on each one are exactly the same. It's up to you as to which one you choose. However, I strongly suggest that you read all the questions as you go along before you read the book. In other words, read the questions first and then start reading the book. This will help you set a purpose for your reading. And this is a very well-validated strategy for improving your reading comprehension. Also, as you go through the reading guide, you'll see that the questions are organized in the order in which they appear, in which the material appears in the book. And for each question, you'll see what chapter of the book it comes from. So this is, again, for your ease of studying. You'll know the question is based on information that you find in that chapter. Hope that's clear. For the most part, these questions in the reading guide are what we might call comprehension level questions, although some do call for more interpretation. The point of us having a reading guide is to make sure that we all feel confident in understanding what Lenin was saying. Okay, so it's to give us confidence, it's to make us feel strong in our understanding. After we have all read the book, using the reading guide independently as we study, we will then gather in groups in our branches, our pre-branches, or other groups to discuss. And the first phase of discussion will be to go over the reading guide. Again, we want to make sure we all feel confident understanding Lenin's words, and there will be support materials sent to the discussion leaders for that process. Following the first discussion group where we go over the reading, we will continue the discussion, and that will involve more of an application of Lenin's ideas to our current day and to our current contexts. And we strongly recommend that branch leadership schedule at least 2 or 3 sessions altogether for all of these discussions. So in terms of being organized, something that I've found is that it's really helpful to get things calendared in advance so that people know how much time they have to read the book, and then how much time to be prepared for the discussions and to participate. And again, we'll be providing discussion guides to the steering committees and other local party leadership bodies with questions and activities for the discussion groups. At the end of the entire discussion process, so after probably 3 discussion sessions, each group will be creating a document about the application of Lenin's ideas to your own local context. These documents will then be sent back to national leadership as part of the preparations for our party congress. So to recap, immediate tasks: make sure everyone has access to the book itself. You need to have an account on the party store to order the book. We can send out the link if people don't want to order the book that way through the PSL store and don't currently have an account. We will send you the link to do so, to create the account. So get the book, choose your format for the reading guide, PDF or Word doc. Start reading. That's the immediate task. For local steering committees and other leadership bodies, set the dates for 3 discussions, 1 to go over the reading guide and 2 for application discussions. We think that 2 weeks is a reasonable amount of time to read and do the study guide, but obviously your mileage may vary. Discussion leaders, review the discussion guides and other support materials and contact the national staff with any questions you may have. In conclusion, I'd like to quote from the PSL Constitution that one of the responsibilities of membership in the Party for Socialism and Liberation is, and I quote, study, advancement, and defense of the party's program and of Marxism. The Constitution goes on to elaborate. Every party member must work to fully understand, advance, and defend the party's program and Marxism. Members should constantly endeavor to deepen their political knowledge and understanding through systematic, continuing study. Let's do it, comrades. We'll give it back to Alberti.
All right, yeah, there we go. Okay, oh. Oh. Hey, there it goes. Okay. Okay, sorry about that, Conrad. So now we have a little bit of time for question and answer. we don't have a ton of time, and we do have a ton of participants. We have a lot of people in the room here in Albuquerque, and we have even more comrades online. One thing to keep in mind is that this is really the kickoff for a month of study. So we want to give some time to ask questions, but there's also going to be lots of engagement with the text, and there's going to be lots of engagement at the local level.
Audio very low.
Okay, sorry, can you guys hear me now?
Yeah, better yet.
Okay, all right, sorry, everybody. Okay, so what I was saying is that we have a little bit of time for discussion, but we have a lot of participants. So I just want to remind everyone that this is the kickoff for a month of study. So we're going to have lots of engagement with the text. We're going to be meeting, as James was describing, in our locals to talk about the text. So what we're going to do is we're going to take 2 questions from the room and then 2 questions from the comrades on the national webinar. And then I'll put in the chat the email for the PSL national staff. So that if you have other burning questions, you can email them there and we can get back to you in a timely way. So with that, for those on the webinar that want to ask a question, what you're going to want to do is hit raise hand, and then we'll just take the 2 that pop up first. But for now, do we have any questions here in the room in Albuquerque? It's okay if we don't necessarily. All right, so Albuquerque doesn't have any burning questions. Oh, okay, Brian's gonna make a comment though. Go ahead.
We should have said this in the beginning, comrades, if you're thinking about what your question is. The Venezuelans contacted us this morning, and we sent a video message at the request from to Nicolas Maduro, a message of solidarity to the PSL. I think comrades saw that there was an attempted assassination of Maduro yesterday, failed, but clearly the Trump administration, the CIA, and the Pentagon are determined to try to overthrow the government and to stop the Bolivarian process. Gloria, if you want to come up, I think we want to have a short video of solidarity from this gathering to the comrades in Venezuela. And so we want to, let's, can we do a picture? For those of us who want to extend a hand of solidarity to the Bolivarian Revolution, let's raise our hand and raise our fist. And from the Party for Socialism and Liberation, send a message of solidarity and intensified resistance and opposition to the machinations of the CIA and U.S. imperialism, which is determined to stop the revolutionary process. And the revolutionaries are determined to go forward and to win. Viva Venezuela, Viva Chavez, and Viva Maduro. Viva! Viva Chavez! Viva Maduro! Thank you very much, comrade.
All right, very good. So because of a limited amount of time and we don't have any questions in the room, and we have one question online, I guess I'm gonna, Brian, you want to read the question? Yeah. Okay, so Brian knows the question from online, and then Gloria, do you mind
Go ahead.
coming up and asking? I think precisely what the comrades Brian and Dino have said about not being so far ahead of people, despite what we may have in practical narrative or political differences. I'd like Brian to please comment on the issue of. I'm sorry, what? Oh, I'd like to ask Brian if he could comment on a practical issue about things that come up in mobilizations of popular actions that are national, like the Pride Parade or Martin Luther King events that take place. Sometimes they may be something that's maybe a parallel action that's a little more left. What would be our approach to these actions? Both, or how do we see our growth?
If we're running out of time, why don't we just have this not be the second question?
The first question that was sent in read, it seems important, if Lenin was insistent on fighting the enemy, to identify precisely who the enemy is. Who today is the enemy? Can those that Lenin calls, quote, fellow travelers be, in some circumstances, the enemy?
Well, if we focus on fellow travelers, we're not going to learn much from this book. The point of Lenin's argument is that the proletarian vanguard cannot lead the revolution by itself, that it must be able to attract and bring into its ranks actively, in some cases, or with sympathy, broader masses of people who may not be revolutionary at all at the moment, but who, under the circumstances of a crisis, a government-wide crisis, an economic crisis, a military crisis, could be brought into a revolutionary fight. The goal with fellow travelers is to recruit them and to strengthen them and to make them feel comfortable and confident. We don't want to focus on other parts of the left and attack them, or other parts of the masses of people who have a progressive attitude, but who at a certain point, or at least until this point, aren't revolutionaries. Maybe none of them will be. But you never know when people can play a role in a revolutionary process. You never know that. The whole point of this is not to abandon any section of the masses in advance on the basis that they are not left enough, or to denigrate the masses of people. Marx made the point that the ideas of any society are the ideas of its ruling class. And that's because the ruling class dominates opinion making. It dominates it in all kinds of ways. It dominates it through the family. It dominates it through the media, through the church or the synagogue or the mosque, through bourgeois academic institutions. The bourgeoisie in Washington, where I live, there are think tanks with thousands of intellectuals who are nothing other than the opinion motors with this, with that faction tendency within the bourgeoisie. When you read the Washington Post, they quote this expert from this thing, this expert from this thing, think tank, and this expert from this thing. They all know each other. They go to the same cocktail parties. They're part of the same breed of trained think tanks and academia that are opinion motors. And frankly, the people who sometimes talk the most left, when you get down to when push comes to shove, they're not so left. Fidel, read his autobiography, where he goes and meets with some of the leftists who he was working with in 1952, and they're like criticizing him for not being left enough. He says he meets with them and he says, tomorrow we're going to attack Moncada. Here's the plan. We have 300 guns. We're going to have one detachment go here, another detachment go there, another detachment go there. And then he talks in the book. He says, then I went back with my other comrades and we all snickered and laughed because we knew these guys weren't going to show up. And indeed they did. So, you know, what is a fellow traveler? We don't know. And again, our whole idea, when we started the PSL, there were 30 of us who started this in 2004. We were leaving one group, we're starting our own group. We decided we weren't going to engage in endless polemics with other leftists or even the people who had been our comrades for a long time, who we no longer had confidence in as a grouping. We said 99.9% of the American people don't know anything about any of these groups or anything about socialism. If we're going to succeed, that's who we have to reach. We're not going to waste our time, which doesn't mean all polemics are a waste of time, on the contrary. But we don't want to waste all of our time in these small tempest in a teapot political battles against people who are not as revolutionary as we are. And you know, I have to say, when I was 15 years old, my brother Richard Becker asked me, he said, what do you think? Are you a liberal? And I said, of course I'm a liberal, because whenever that was, that meant you were for civil rights, or you were against the war in Vietnam. He said, well, listen to this song. It was Phil Oak's song called "Love Me, Love Me, Love Me." I'm a liberal. And I said, okay, I'm not a liberal anymore. I mean, that's what it is. 5 choruses in the song, and then a year and a half on this conference. So we really have to be open-minded, creative. Of course, we're going to argue with our friends, not treat other leftists as the enemy, have principled polemics when necessary, but from the point of view of illuminating some other issue. We had the pamphlet Socialism and War, Two Trends. It's a polemic against ISO because the ISO in the case of Syria, or in the case of Libya, or in the case of China, or in the case of Russia, always somehow ends up with the same position as the State Department. So then that's a principal polemic, which, by the way, doesn't mean that we won't be marching with them on Saturday or Sunday against the Klan and the Nazis in Washington, because we will. Matter of fact, we're talking to them today, this morning, and we'll talk to them tomorrow. So we have a principled polemic to illuminate the difference, and at the same time, where possible, have united fronts. It's going to be a long, drawn-out struggle. In terms of the other question that Gloria posed, there are many. I actually don't. There's documents that we've written for the Liberation News that I think people can read about. That again, we don't want to take progressive activities, whether it's Labor Day or Pride Day or Martin Luther King Day parades, where you have some corporations marching, or in some cases cops marching, where large numbers of people, either from the Black community, from MLK Day, or the LGBTQ community are coming out, working class folks. We don't want to, again, target those days as if they're the enemy and then we're going to break them up and disrupt them. We want to explain again and intervene and win people over and show why the cops and the corporations certainly can't be real friends of any oppressed community anywhere. I want to also say another thing about tactics, and I had meant to say this in the beginning. When you think about Answer Coalition, that name, I want to just take a moment to explain how that name came about. We were in Lower Manhattan on September 11th when the attacks happened. And it was a mess. The buildings came down, thousands of people were dead. Even some of our own comrades were in those buildings, family members. It was a terrible moment. And the Bush administration, which had been so unpopular, seized hold of it to use all the rage and the grief to generate war hysteria. And so 3 days after September 11th, those groups that were not cowards, most of them were cowards. The anarchist movement that we were part of, the anti-globalization movement, that collapsed, canceled demonstrations, said now is not the appropriate time to demonstrate. It was a full-out hysteria and fear, and thousands of Muslims were being rounded up. There was just absolute fear. We started the Answer Coalition 3 days after September 11th. And we had been gathering at Union Square in Lower Manhattan, the progressive people. And people were starting to mildly say things like, war is not the answer. Now, that's very not anti-imperialist. Like, what does it even mean? War is not the answer. Not the answer to what? What it meant was, don't go to war in Iraq. But you couldn't actually, in those first hours and days, you couldn't really come out with a strong anti-imperialist position because the move was so right-wing. So we said, war is not the answer. That's what people changed. So we said, answer. Okay, act now to stop war. And we took a meaningless term and used it because it was something people were championing. And we said, let's have an anti-war demonstration on September 29, 2001, 18 days after September 11th. And we got 25,000 people. Now, again, the slogan was, war is not the answer. That wasn't like, down with U.S. imperialism or anything like that. It was a very mild slogan. But it started the anti-war movement. It was the beginning. So sometimes the slogans have to be based on the moment. You can't say in advance, we're always going to have the most left-wing slogan. Sometimes the most moderate slogan can be the best slogan you can do at a particular time. And frankly, the Panthers made a point that everybody thinks about the Panthers, armed self-defense. What they were doing in the community was demanding and having demonstrations to put up stop signs where kids were getting killed. You can't get much more moderate than asking the government to put up a stop sign. But that's what brought the community together. So, but anyway, the point being, we have to take it from where we are. We don't create the battlefield terrain at all circumstances. The comrades who are organizing in the military, we started March Forward. We recruited the most anti-imperialist GIs who had gone to Iraq as true believers. And they went, and based on their experience, they became anti-imperialist fighters and communists. We started the organization March Forward. We went to every military base, and they had to fight on those bases because the reaction from the MPs and the officers was so intense. And a lot of the soldiers and Marines and sailors were reactionaries, and had just come back, and they had been in combat with Iraq. But we were winning them over and recruiting. We recruited a lot of people. We created the most important anti-imperialist GI organization, which is what also happened in the Vietnam War. When we organized soldiers during Vietnam, it was hard at first. In 68 and 69, it was really hard. By 1970, 5,000 officers got fragged by they rolled fragmentation grenades into the tent rather than going to battle against those officers. That's a big part of why the war had to be ended. The soldiers had become the most radical elements against the war. How do you go on? For those of you who haven't gone out organizing on a military base, you don't start with the anti-imperialist slogan. You start with who's got PTSD, who's maybe a friend has committed suicide, who just had their legs blown off and is not getting medical treatment. You've got to reach working class people in a way that you can really reach them. And once you start to reach them and show that you and not the officers are the advocates for the rank and file, you can pull them into a revolutionary direction. Without the soldiers, ultimately the Bolsheviks would not have been able to seize power because the soldiers refused to march against the Soviets in November 1917. But that took months and months and months of dedication. So whenever we're agitating, we're going to a small town in Mississippi, it's going to be a different kind of agitation than if you're in Washington, D.C. You just have to, sort of do the best you can where you are and use a lot of common sense.
All right, thank you, everyone. So for those of you on the webinar, what we're going to do from here is conclude the webinar. If you have any burning questions, please direct them to your local elected leadership or to your NOC point person, and they will be the ones who give you answers. Other than that, also on the webinar, if you could just type in the chat if you're in a city where you're meeting with more than one person, how many folks are in the room with you, just so we kind of have an idea of how many comrades are going to make the webinar today. If you do that now, we'd appreciate it. But that's it for the webinar. Thank you all. Bye.
All right, that worked.
Good
job.
We need to get Brian right away.
Okay, right now?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.